I have to tell you, absolutely great questions, every single one of them. I would encourage, I see some people starting to move around. When Luke said, you know, we want a question from the left over here or from the right over there, he's not making a comment on your political philosophy. So it's okay if you stay where you are, you know, left or right, it's okay. Putin, Trump, and NATO. Need I say more? You know, I had a busy morning this morning. I didn't get a chance to really read the paper on the way over here. But I know that in all likelihood, at least two of those three out of those three subjects had to be on the front page today. I mean, it just, you know, I have no idea what might have happened or been tweeted in the early morning hours. But no doubt, this is a subject that is of interest all the time. We're very, very fortunate today in terms of this next panel. Dr. Lori Murray, who's an adjunct fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, has a distinguished career, and we're very lucky to have her here today. She has been involved in the foreign policy, defense areas for her career, serving both on the congressional side, also on the administration side, inside the State Department. She has held a number of distinguished positions. You can look at them in your pamphlet there. Obviously, Distinguished National Security Chair at the Naval Academy. She's worked in a number of administrations that were led on both sides of the aisle. I can't help but mention she's the former president of the World Affairs Councils of America. So when you look at you know, what our World Affairs Councils do, how important their mission is, I just have a great sense of gratitude for what you've done in that position. So please join me in welcoming our next panelists. And Dr. Murray, I'll ask you to introduce the others.
Thank you so much.
Let me sit here in the middle.
Good morning, everyone. Great power competition is back. President Obama's assessment, his administration's assessment in 2010, was that Russia was no longer our enemy, and that the chances for a great power conflict was at a historic low. President Trump's administration, in their national security assessment, has said great power competition is back, Russia, China, and we are at an all-time high since the end of the Cold War in terms of conflict, including with Russia and China on a state power level. So today, to talk about that, we have our distinguished panelists. And I first want to introduce Tom Graham, who is co-founder and co-director of the Russian Studies Project at Yale University. He's also managing director at Kissinger and Associates, responsible for Russia and Eurasia. He has had a distinguished career, including in the Foreign Service, where he's actually served in Moscow. And I'll let you read the rest of his very distinguished career and accomplishments, which are formidable. And we also have Vice Admiral Bob Murrett, who is Deputy Director of the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism at Syracuse University, and former Vice Director for Intelligence, U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's had a distinguished career in naval intelligence, and we are about to be off and running here on tapping this expertise. And I really would like to start with one of the greatest threats facing us today that you're all very familiar with, the 2018 elections, just about a week or so away. Russia's challenge, Putin's challenge to our democracy. And I first want to turn to Tom and talk about domestically in the US, and then Bob, I'd like to talk to you about NATO. But starting with the threat here in the United States and getting your assessment, Tom, of that threat. Former DNI Clapper said in his book that this is not just a Cold War, tit-for-tat, old adversary just nicking us. This is actually a sustainable and very serious attack on American values and a very sustained attack on American values and institutions. And as you know, the White House hosted at the press conference our leading intelligence officials just a couple of months ago, who said the 2018 challenge is real, deep, and sustained. Justice Department just had an indictment against another Russian on this issue. And Connecticut is among the 21 states that were actually has been hacked by the Russians. So, Tom, could you assess how that threat fits into the overall Russian threat? And I'm actually going to let you lead on your comments in terms of the overall Russia, and then if you could address that overall Russia-U.S. relationship.
A simple question. First of all, thank you very much for being here. It's a great opportunity to speak to a very distinguished audience. Let me start with the sort of the bigger picture, and maybe get down to the question of interference. I mean, there's a lot of talk now about a new Cold War. And I think the people who talk about a new Cold War don't remember what the old Cold War was like. The old Cold War, the original one, was a global geopolitical, ideological, existential struggle between two superpowers that had nuclear arsenals that were capable of destroying civilization several times over. Russia, to my mind, is not the Soviet Union. It's not the Soviet Union in capabilities. It's not the Soviet Union in ambitions. It doesn't have the goal to remake the world in its own model. What it wants to be is a great power among other great powers. And it wants to be respected as a great power. Now, I think we need to take the challenge seriously. It's in Ukraine. It's in the Middle East. Clearly, it's in the meddling in elections. It's in cyberspace. But I think we also need to be careful not to overreact to the challenge the Russians present. This is a country that has significant domestic problems itself. Its economy is stagnating. It's actually lagging behind much of the United States, certainly in technological development. Cyberspace may be a place where they are competitive. And I think the challenges that Russia faces on its own domestic side are going to limit its ability to pursue an assertive foreign policy over time. And I think we just need to keep that in mind. Now, when you look at the meddling issue, I mean, it's clear that the Russians are meddling. I think this is one of the areas where they think that they can compete successfully with the United States. It's, to their mind, an asymmetrical response. And what they're trying to do, broadly speaking, I would argue, is to tarnish the image of American democracy. We think about the hacking. I think the most important aspect of this from the Russian standpoint was the hacking of the DNC in 2016, the release of the information that cast a not favorable light on the way the Democratic Party had conducted its primaries, the way it may have favored Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders. Another way of saying, your system is as rigged as our system is. So don't complain about us and how we conduct our Duma elections. You've got your own problems. I think that's continuing now. Again, great problems to play on the fissures in our own society. Now, I'm one of the people, and probably in a minority, that thinks that we tend to exaggerate the threat that the Russians pose to us. The money they're spending is small. It's certainly small compared to what the campaigns themselves spend in American politics. And I think the influence they have it's tangible, but we shouldn't exaggerate it. The problems we face in this country are largely of our own making. We know what all those problems are. The fissures in this society grow out of debates among our own citizens. Are the Russians going to play on those? Absolutely. But I think it's wrong for us to reach the conclusion that the Russians are the reason that we have some of these problems, and that we need to push back in a way that puts the focus exclusively on Russia. Now, we need to do some of those things, but the real things that we need to do to deal with what we see as a Russia challenge are in fact things that we ought to be doing for ourselves to deal with the environment in which we're operating. It goes well beyond Russia. We all know that we need to harden our computer systems. We need to make our electoral process more secure. We've known that for a long time. We're taking some of the steps now. We're not doing nearly enough. We're not doing nearly enough because this is really a complicated political problem to deal with. It involves federal and state relations. It involves public, non-private sector. And the whole issue of security gets into issues of personal liberties as well. So it's a very tough political problem. And we haven't found the solution yet, although we're beginning to do more in that regard. Second, there's a tremendous amount of concern about Russian meddling and disinformation, fake news. Russians certainly engage in this. But the point that I make is that the Russians didn't invent fake news. It's out there. It's been there for some time. And while we need to expose what they're doing that is nefarious from our standpoint, a larger part of the problem is educating our public and how to deal with the information that comes across their screens every day. An educated public is our best defense. The final point I would make is that I think there's a tendency to exaggerate what the Russians are doing because we lack confidence in our own abilities. The United States needs to deal, I think, honestly and sincerely and effectively with our own domestic problems. We need to regain our confidence in our ability to manage our society successfully. And as our confidence grows, we not only send the appropriate message to the rest of the world, it has a positive impact on the way Russians look at us, and it's the best thing that we can do to reduce the risk that the Russians are going to think that they can interfere in our society in a way that is advantageous to them over the long run.
Thank you. And Bob, similarly, if you can give us an overview of the Russian role in Europe and NATO, and then to the specific threat of undermining NATO from within by using these type of tactics in terms of eroding democracy.
A great question, Lori, and I'll also build on what Tom just walked us through. And in the spirit of having a bottom line up front, I am an unabashed advocate for NATO and the alliance. It's hard to imagine a world without NATO, specifically if you look back to the 1940s and all that the alliance has done for several decades now, and particularly what they've done since the what I'll call the post-Cold War era, and all the different work that they do, not just with respect to the relationship between the NATO alliance and Russia, but also the impact that they have around the world with ongoing things that are primarily, I would trace, certainly for this audience, and based on the discussion that we're having today on the fact that NATO is essentially a political and diplomatic alliance, which also has a military component, which is a point that I think a lot of people lose sight of. But Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, and his predecessor Anders Fogh Rasmussen, and the whole North Atlantic Council, which is known as the regular sessions of very vigorous diplomatic engagement that we have with state secretaries, secretaries of state, defense ministers, and also heads of state on a regular basis. The work that the NPG does, the Nuclear Planning Group, within the NATO alliance, the vital diplomatic role that they have globally and in terms of dealing with Russia, and so many other things around the world are something that probably deserves a lot more attention and deserves a lot more credit for all the fires that they've been putting out for so many years now, pre and post Cold War. I think the other point that's worth mentioning is it's also a military alliance, which tends to get all the attention, but as I said, is probably secondary to the diplomatic and state alliance that exists for all the countries. And along those lines, I think a lot of folks underestimate the global impact that the NATO alliance has with respect to Russia, but also this is a vignette, but I think it's important. When I first did an exercise with Japan in the Western Pacific, it was on USS Kitty Hawk. We had to do procedures for coalition operations. We used NATO ATP-5, used NATO documentation in the Western Pacific for combined exercises. I would also mention along those lines that Australia is essentially a member of NATO and the alliance, essentially, along with some other countries that are like-minded beyond the Middle East, and also along those lines, Istanbul cooperation countries and the Partnership for Peace countries in the NATO alliance, which, by the way, includes Russia because of the important role they have in trying to provide reassurance to Russia and letting them not just observe, but also to some degree participate in exercises as much as we can. And I think this dates back, and Tom is a far better expert, Lori, on this than I am, but during the Yeltsin era, in the immediate post-Cold War era, when the NATO alliance really bent over backwards to try to provide as much reassurance to Russia and engage with them as vigorously as they possibly could in new circumstances after the end of the Cold War. A couple other points that I would make relative to ongoing operations currently is we also probably underestimate how vigorous ongoing NATO operations are with respect to Russia, which are providing deterrence on a day-in, day-out basis. Operation Atlantic Resolve, which most people probably haven't heard of, has significant deployments of the United States and other NATO personnel to Poland, the Baltic states, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and other countries in Eastern Europe, including a fairly heavy ground footprint in Poland, which is going to be sustained for some time. It provides more than a tripwire in terms of deterring Russia, and at the same time, as I said, the vigorous diplomatic engagement that we have to try to reassure Russia from the NATO alliance as well. I wanted to make one more point on expansion of the alliance. As you know, several countries, including some that I just mentioned, like Poland and the Baltic states, and Czech Republic, Slovakia, and others in Eastern Europe have been added to the alliance over the last 12 to 15 years, actually the last 20 years. And there has been an ongoing debate about whether or not that was something which aggravated Russia to the point they had to respond. The point I would make on that is that, as you know, the procedures for a country to join the alliance, since its first formation in the 1940s, are fairly rigorous. There's a very tough set of standards you have to meet in terms of democratic institutions. There's a whole process and a series of events you have to go through. But if a democratically elected country wants to join the alliance, who are we to say no? And I think we've seen that play out over the last 10 or 20 years. So just kind of a background, and again, key points, it's a diplomatic alliance as well as a military alliance, and I think the diplomacy with respect to Russia and other countries around the world is probably as significant as anything, and it's hard to imagine a world without NATO.
And the challenge of Putin playing in domestic politics and helping to, I mean, populism is on the rise in any case, but helping to really fuel that.
I think to some degree that's most worrisome currently in Eastern Europe and a couple of countries, the developments that have taken place in the last 6 months. You know, from an intelligence perspective, Russian active measures, and that's a term that I won't give to you in Russian, are something that tend to just try to multiply existing fissures that exist in countries and not start from scratch. And it's something we need to be very aware of and be conscious when it's happening and try to push back from it as effectively as we can, but also engage. And as Tom was saying, to some degree, it doesn't involve just providing assistance and help and transparent aid to countries, for example, in Eastern Europe, but also parts of safe NATO as opposed to unsafe NATO, but also dealing with the Russian Republic in ways that can try to bring them into the 21st century and join the family of nations.
So Tom, picking up on Bob's point about NATO expansion, I mean, this is one of Putin's, in his list of crimes against Russia during the post-Cold War period by the United States. NATO expansion, I think, is at the top of the list. Fair grievance, do we handle that properly?
You know, that's a difficult question. I think if you go back and look at the history, I mean, the Russians will always insist that some sort of guarantee was given that NATO wouldn't expand if Germany was reunified. If you go back and read the documents at that time, it's hard to see any ironclad assurances that were given. We talked about the expansion of NATO at that time in the context of German reunification. And what we were talking about is not extending the forces into Eastern Germany as it came back into a reunified Germany. The idea that the Warsaw Pact was going to break up wasn't on anybody's mind at that point. If there's a legitimate grievance on the Russian part, I would argue that it is that they thought not so much of NATO expansion, but as the reformulation of European security in a way that would integrate Russia, and at that time the Warsaw Pact, fully with NATO in this European security architecture. You know, obviously everything changes when the Warsaw Pact breaks up. And the United States faces, and along with our NATO allies at that time, this big question of how you stabilize and create a secure environment for these countries that are now once again independent and are sort of floating in the security world. You know, I would argue that NATO expansion was a reasonable response to that. We always got pushback from the Russians. I think, as has already been said, you know, an effort was made to integrate the Russians in some way. It didn't work out. The real problem, I think, emerges when we pursue expansion beyond the former Warsaw Pact countries into countries that were once part of the Soviet Union. Not so much the Baltic states, which were always considered somewhat separate, even by the Soviets during the Soviet period, but Ukraine and Georgia in particular. Those were the real red lines for the Russians, and something the Russians had told us from the moment the Soviet Union broke up, that they would resist any effort to bring those two countries into NATO. And you have seen the reaction in Georgia in 2008, the reaction in Ukraine in 2014, against what they saw as a very specific threat to the way they conceive of their own national security. My own mind, I think we could have handled this issue in a different way, ease some of the Russian concerns. I am one of those people who believe that expanding NATO into Ukraine and Georgia is probably not the best idea from our own national interest. And I think we did it in a way, again, without the support of our allies, Germany and France in particular, that gave the Russians a reason and a capability to push back through the use of force that they might not have under circumstances.
Great, yeah. I agree with all that.
So, Bob, to the President Trump quotient on NATO cohesion, you've addressed, and very clearly in your remarks, the question of whether NATO is obsolete or not and how relevant it is today. But what about the other piece of this? A lot of analysts have said that President Trump's embracing of Article 5, which is the all for one and one for all article in the NATO agreement, where the only time it's ever been triggered is when the U.S. was hit at 9/11, when the NATO allies came to our support by triggering Article 5. Do you think President Trump embracing of Article 5 was too little, too late? Is it undermining cohesion? Is it helping Putin achieve his goals in terms of weakening NATO?
Yeah, I think I was showing this to some of the others earlier, but I'll start with a quote from our Secretary of Defense. I'll put on my reading glasses first, if that's okay for everybody. But I think it gets to the question that Lori just made. This is from Jim Mattis. To strengthen our work jointly with more allies, our organization's processes and procedures must be ally-friendly. I've been a supreme allied commander in NATO and in a previous job, and I'm very encouraged by what I've seen and cannot be better served by the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. The important point, I think, with respect to what the Secretary of Defense said and others, and I would note that our Secretary of State, the first thing he did upon taking office was to join the NATO ministerial meetings in Belgium on his first trip the day after, actually the afternoon of the day he was sworn in as Secretary of State. Getting back to one of the points I made earlier, NATO is a treaty obligation. It's not an executive order. I mean, to withdraw ourselves from any part of it, specifically with Article 5, as you mentioned, would take an act of Congress, specifically something in the Senate. So it's not something that I would view as, you know, trivial or easy to overturn. It's also not, in its essence, a transactional alliance. I think, as you know, and not just the current administration, but as you know, Secretary Gates during both the Bush 43 and Obama administration was also, when he would attend the defense ministerials, to do his best to try to twist the arms from the NATO countries with respect to defense spending and something which has been sort of point of emphasis by the current administration. But there are so many, as I said, non-transactional support that you get from all the nations in the alliance and also the ones in the extended alliance, like the Istanbul cooperation countries, as I mentioned earlier, that are not necessarily reflected in their defense budget and other means. So I think you're always looking for an equal lift and an equal level of burden sharing as in all the countries that are in the alliance membership and the extended parts that we have of the alliance, but it's still very much in the interest of our own nation and all the nations that are members, and there'll continue to be some back and forth, and I think that's largely constructive.
Tom, you were saying that we need to have a balanced view and not over-exaggerate Russian threats. During the Cold War, we found, common areas of interest when, the challenge was probably its most intense and ideologically based, as you were pointing out. And one of the areas that we had worked on was arms control, and it was just announced yesterday, or reported yesterday, that President Trump may be withdrawing from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, which eliminated a class of ground-based weapon systems between 500 kilometers and 5,000 kilometers. And this arms control piece seems to be falling apart, and that was because the Russians are violating it. And if you look, at Syria, once ISIS has been defeated, we're in conflict in terms of the future of Syria. You kind of hop around the world, and there doesn't seem to be too many areas of common interest. And I was just wondering if you can lend some insight into, with this area of arms control sort of seeming to fall off the map, where might be the common interests that we could work together with Russia?
Well, to begin with, arms control should be a common interest between our two countries. If you look at the INF treaty that you talked about, we have been concerned about Russian violations of the treaty for some time now. The Russians, of course, believe that we have violated the treaties in some way. It's a perfect case where we ought to sit down and work through these issues, because my understanding is there are technological solutions that would ease the concerns of both countries and put us back in the eyes of one another, put us back in compliance with the treaty. I think it's an important element of the overall arms control, but we also need to recognize that the global environment has changed significantly since 1987, when that treaty was first signed. Other countries had developed these types of weapon systems, and so there needs to be a broader discussion of how we're going to deal with these weapons going forward. But a fundamental first step in being able to do that is for the United States and Russia to come back into compliance. Where we'll end up, I think, is an open question, given where certain individuals in this administration are at this point. More broadly, I think we need to recognize that the relationship with Russia is a broadly competitive one. When the Soviet Union broke up 25 years ago, there was great hope in Washington, I think to an extent in Moscow as well, that our relationship would become largely cooperative, talk of strategic partnership. I think we've come to realize, certainly since 2014 and Russia's annexation of Crimea, that we really are divided by significant issues of the appropriate principles that guide the structure of world order. There's geopolitical conflict, and there's obviously a difference in values. That doesn't mean we can't cooperate in certain areas. And there's certain areas where we have to work together out of our own self-interest. I think arms control is one of them. I think if you think more broadly about proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, it's an area where it's difficult to be effective if the United States and Russia aren't working together. And we have done a lot together, despite the current tension in relations, things that continue below the surface that we don't talk about that much. If we think about the issue we just talked about in the previous panel, terrorism, there is still a level of exchange of information that's going on between the intelligence services. which I think is appropriate. The Russians, President Putin, gave us credit for helping them thwart a terrorist attack in St. Petersburg a little less than a year ago. And so that, I think, is still an area of cooperation. We still cooperate in space. And I think all of these things advance our national interest. Where we get to sort of those issues that dominate the public discussion today, put the meddling to aside for a moment, Ukraine, Syria, elsewhere, North Korea to a certain extent. The real challenge is for the United States and Russia to come together, somewhat in the way we did in the Cold War, and determine how we're going to regulate this competition so that it doesn't spin out of control and create the type of conflict that neither country wants at this point. That, in a sense, is a cooperative effort as well. So the cooperation in a large sense comes in cooperating to regulate competition so that we can continue to compete, but in ways that are less risky for our overall survival as national societies.
And Bob, on the INF agreement, the quick responses to this indication that President Trump may pull out was that, from arms control analysts, was that Europe would explode on this, that they would get very upset, their anticipation that they would be very upset. Most of Putin's saber rattling has been focused on NATO, as well as the U.S. in NATO, and the violation of the INF agreement was really sparked by his threatening with this dual capable use of an INF ground-based system that he's deployed. How do you see this affecting the NATO alliance, and and also in terms of Putin's nuclear saber rattling, which he also did in Ukraine, if the alliance had come in to stop him in Ukraine? How do you see this playing out? And is it intensifying to a miscalculated or misperceived conflict?
I'd like to be cautiously optimistic on that one, and kind of building on what Tom said. I think, and two of our secretaries of defense, I think, understood this better than anybody, and I'll single out Bob Gates and Ash Carter, who had deep and broad understanding of Russia and fully understood that at the same time we needed to confront them on certain issues, but they were both advocates of strenuous, wide, and deep engagement with the Russian government. And a lot of that was based on their own experience and, as I said, the breadth and depth that both of them brought to the Defense Department. Now, I think with respect to INF, I think it's just representative of other broader issues that we need to deal with from the standpoint of the alliance and Russia, and ways that we can, as Tom was kind of referring to some degree, this sounds counterintuitive, but at the same time we are confronting them on certain issues, and electoral interference in elections is probably close to the top of the list. Engage them vigorously, and nothing is more important to engage with Russia on than anything pertaining to their nuclear arsenal and what I'll describe as delivery vehicles, which is what INF is getting back to. And we're all familiar with the history and some pretty courageous positions that were taken by members of the NATO alliance in the 1980s, specifically the Netherlands and the United Kingdom and others, as part of the kickoff of the INF deployments during the Reagan administration. I think fast forwarding to the present day, what we have to do is engage with Russia as much as we can, because they have an extremely large nuclear arsenal that is deteriorating largely because of lack of maintenance, and the security of which is not as good as it should be, not because of any sinister plot by the Russians, but just because it is so darn expensive. And Tom can talk in a lot more detail than I can about things like the Nunn-Lugar Amendment and work that we have been doing with Russia, which has been very cooperative. And I would say, with respect to trying to secure their nuclear arsenal and operations in outer space, when you talk to people that are engaged in those two fields, they have gotten to know their counterparts in Russia so much. Some of them have been dating each. I mean, there's been a history here which has been largely good in terms of keeping lines of communication open for decades now, and I would hope that will continue in the future. So I think for us and for the NATO alliance, we have to keep in mind this two sides of the same coin that we have in terms of the relationship with Russia. At the same time, letting them know certain things they are doing are not acceptable, and telling that in very frank terms, and doing everything that we can to counter it. But at the same time, and again, particularly when it comes to nuclear-related issues and delivery vehicles and the cooperation we've also had on chemical weapons, which is noteworthy, staying engaged with them, and also to some degree, and you have to articulate this carefully, making them more confident so that they don't do something that might be foolish.
Well, thank you so much, and I'd like to open this up to the audience now to ask questions, and let's see, why don't we start right here?
My name is Mark Molesky. I'm a professor of business administration at Tungus Community College in Farmington, Connecticut. President Trump has been largely absent from the conversation. My father was deported to Russia along with 1 million other Poles at the beginning of World War II. So I come to the subject of Russia from a skeptical point of view. My question is, to what extent does President Trump understand the power relationship? Russia tends to come from the perspective of power. American presidents tend to begin the relationship with likability. If I can establish a relationship, if we can shake hands and understand each other, we can have a relationship. To what extent do you believe that the president understands Russian history and the view of the world?
Tom.
Is that a question to me, huh? I think the short answer is he doesn't. Do I need to go into more detail on that? Again, we have a president that does place a lot in personal contacts. He thinks he's the greatest negotiator in the world, and he just sit down with people that they'll solve all the problems. You've seen that most recently in North Korea, where we went from on the cusp of a major military conflict to we've solved that problem now, although very little has changed in the situation on the ground. I think something similar has happened with the Russians. But the point I would make is that we still have a national security apparatus. And we still have a national security apparatus that is seeped in the history of this relationship and knows how to deal with it. And does, I think, set some of the parameters within which the president operates. So I think it's absolutely true that the policy is harsher now towards Russia than it was in the last years of the Obama administration, no matter what the president of the United States may think. Whether that's the appropriate policy or not is something that we can have a debate about. I tend to think that we are operating in a way that isn't producing the types of results that we want from Russia. But again, that is a debate that's going on separately from what might be going on in the head of the president of the United States at this point.
Let's go back there.
Hi, my name is Tom Trumbull. I was in the Marine Corps years ago. My question is, with the slow melting of the North Pole, Russia seems to be moving more and more arms and military bases in that area. I guess, how do we feel about that, and what do we do about that? Because obviously that makes them much closer to North America.
That's a big issue for the NATO alliance, and specifically for countries like Norway and Iceland, as you know, both of which are members of NATO. The Northern Sea route is largely open, and not just north of Russia, but also north of Canada, much more than it used to be. As Thad Allen, the former commandant of the Coast Guard, used to say, he says, I have no political opinion, but I can tell you there's a lot less ice up there. I think, and there are some specific eaches like Svalbard and the Russian camps that are expanding up there and so forth, which have some parallels, by the way, to things that are happening in East China Sea and South China Sea with respect to China. To step back, I would say that there are changes in different parts of the world directly related to climate change that will present security challenges in the future, and what's happening in the northern regions are only one dimension of that. You may have noted that just 3 years ago now, the Commander-in-Chief of our Pacific Command had climate change as his #1 long-term security threat for U.S. Now Indo-PACOM. It's no longer Pacific Command, it's India-Pacific Command. But I think climate change will present significant security challenges for our children and grandchildren, and among the most acute ones will probably be in the Western Pacific, South Asia, and perhaps moreover in northern latitudes. It's a good question.
Can I jump in here on this one? I mean, this is a good question, but, and I think we need to be aware of what the Russians are doing. But what I always like to do is try to put myself in the position of the person sitting in the Kremlin and thinking about their security challenges. Climate change, the melting of the ice, has opened up Russia's north for the first time in history. That used to be a border that was easy to defend if you were sitting in Moscow. Now you've got to worry about how you're going to defend that. Some of the military force that's going in there is for defensive purposes. It's to protect the sea lane that is opening up. It's something that they didn't have to do before. And that comes on top of a host of other security problems that you face. Putin likes to present his foreign policy as a success story at this point. But again, if you look around the periphery of Russia, he's in Syria, it looks successful, but he doesn't have a way to get out of Syria at this point. He's done some things in Ukraine, destabilized the situation, but that ties down significant forces, and he's also revitalized NATO at the same time. That's a problem for you. Central Asia, Afghanistan looks unstable. You've got to worry about a terrorist threat coming from Central Asia. And then finally, you can talk all you want to about a strategic partnership with China. But China is 1.5 billion people. It's an economy that's 8 to 10 times the size of yours. Its military is increasingly sophisticated, is comparable to yours in many ways. And you've had a history of bad relations with the Chinese. And you got to do all of this with an economy that is 1/15 the size of the United States, with a defense budget that is 1/10 to 1/12 the size of the United States, and by the way, your economy is stagnating. So how would you like to be the military person who has to devise the security strategy for Russia at this point? Again, I'm not saying that we don't need to take these things seriously, but I think, again, the point that I keep making is don't exaggerate it. This is a country that has significant problems. If we pursue our policy wisely, we can manage this without a great deal of hysteria. We need to be confident. We need to be confident in our own abilities. We need to set the purpose and follow through effectively.
I'd just like to emphasize one of the points that Tom made is, one of the things you hear in security circles is, Russia and China, two totally different circumstances. And as Tom was articulating, that's going to be even more, I think, dramatic in the future. To include just one other thing I'd add to Russia, the demographics are terrible. It's just not very encouraging at all. So I think it gets back to the point we made earlier about the other side of the coin. To some degree, you have to provide them a certain amount of reassurance so they don't do something really dumb, but at the same time confront them on certain issues pretty strongly.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Vaira Paigel, and I'm a former member of Parliament of the Republic of Latvia. So naturally, as far as we are concerned, the biggest threat to transatlantic security is underestimating the threat of Russia. And we have learned this over the years. NATO is increasing its presence in the Baltic countries. Thank you very much for that. In Poland, because we really see the bigger threat of Russia. And really, I think it's been proven. I mean, the facts have proven this, because it's a murderous regime. And you are finding it in murdering opponents, Putin claiming, you know, that the biggest tragedy was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. You are seeing this in the expansion of methods that Russia is trying to undermine the unity of the EU and the transatlantic community. So my question really is, you know, as NATO is increasing its presence, and you are saying, you know, you shouldn't overestimate what Russia is doing, you know, there seems to be sort of a difference of opinion here, but what are the facts? I mean, the facts are really showing that Russia is, and Putin is very happy about what is happening. He just said it, you know, 2 days ago. He is very happy about the fact that the EU seems to be, you know, kind of wobbly. The same thing about NATO. So where are the facts to say that, you know, he shouldn't overestimate Russian influence and Russian expansion? Thank you.
I think that's
your.
I think Putin is certainly happy with the problems that NATO is experiencing, the EU is experiencing. The point that I wanted to make and wanted to stress is that that is not a consequence of Russian actions, first of all. It's something that we're doing to ourselves. And we need to deal with the various domestic problems we have, to deal with the divisions that have grown up, and it's visible everywhere with the populism, left-wing, right-wing populism out in Europe, this growing dissatisfaction of significant segments of our societies with globalization and the consequences of that, the large gap and growing gap between the very rich and the rest of society. So we have a host of domestic problems that if we deal with effectively, if we can get behind some of the political blockages, will unify the country, no matter, and the NATO alliance and EU, no matter what the Russians do at this point. You know, at the risk of being politically incorrect, if you look at Latvia, you have a large ethnic Russian population that you have to deal with in a certain fashion to make sure that they feel comfortable living in Latvia. And that they can't be exploited by the Russians for purposes that would be inimical to Latvia's defense, Latvia's security and sovereignty. So again, we need to pay attention to what Russia's doing. We don't need to like the regime. There are a lot of things that they're doing that are problematic, but I still think the larger problems are ones of our own making, and if we can solve those problems, we in fact deal with the Russian threat at the same time.
Can we go over there?
Okay, excuse the break.
Can we get a microphone over here? Yes, please.
I was at a NATO meeting some years ago, and one of the NATO diplomats talked to me about safe NATO and unsafe NATO, and he said you have to be sure you listen to the people from unsafe NATO. So, good point.
Third class Julia Benz. Hello again. Many believe that Russia retains
Excuse me, could you hold your microphone a little bit closer to your mouth?
Yes, sorry. Many believe that Russia retains Soviet expansionism as evidenced by their actions in Crimea, which is of great concern to the international stability in Eastern Europe. Do you believe that this is an effort to establish legitimacy in the international dynamic, or is it a classic empire building as we've seen in the past? How do you think that the election interference affected Russia's status in what you called the family of nations?
Well, it's a three-part question.
I don't know if I got all three parts.
Yeah. I think the first two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So I think it's a little bit of both, quite frankly. And I think the third part in terms of electoral interference is, as I said earlier, it's probably right at the top of the list of the things that we need to confront them on and make sure that they don't expand further, to take advantage of fissures that exist in any of the countries in the NATO alliance, and to do so pretty aggressively. Tom?
Yeah, look, on the issue of Russian expansionism, again, I think we need to put this in perspective. If you take the look at the past sort of 25, 30 years of history, Russia influence in terms of geographic expanse is radically different from what it was in 1991. I think the Russians, they look at this and they see most of what they've done as as reactive. They take over Crimea because they're concerned about Ukraine moving into the Western political orbit, security orbit, finally. Same thing that they've done in Georgia. I think there's a hesitation to use conventional military means elsewhere in Europe, in part because of NATO. And I think this is true of the Baltics in particular. You know, the Russians may have some questions about whether NATO countries would honor the Article 5 guarantees, but the risk of being wrong about that are catastrophic for Russia. And I think that puts some caution in the way they're dealing. So I think there's actually a limit on how far Russia wants to expand and how far they can expand. The second point on the election interference, anything that they can do that retards the consolidation of a unified Europe, they see as advantageous. This doesn't mean that they want to invade, that they want to take over Europe. But again, if you put yourself in the position of someone sitting in the Kremlin, what's a unified Europe? A unified Europe is 500 million people with an economy $18 trillion, which is 15 to 16 times our size, with the potential to create a powerful military. It can dwarf Russia in potential, population growth, and power the way the United States does today. That they see as a threat. Again, that doesn't mean we need to like what they're doing, but we need to understand where they're coming from if we're going to be able to develop a policy that advances, protects our interest, but also takes into account what's really driving them, and that we deal with those, that we use those as the pressure points in getting what we want out of a relationship with Russia over the long term.
Great question.
Right here.
Thank you both for being here. I think a lot of the conversation around election meddling, of course, is going to be centering around what the United States did here in, or I should say what Russia did here in the United States. But if I remember my readings correctly, Russian meddling also took part in the French presidential election and the Brexit election. So what about the campaigns of Le Pen, Trump, Nigel Farage, and UKIP do you find outside of just NATO expansion or a unified Europe that you think the Russians would be most intrigued by?
I would add there, you actually have pointed out a differentiation in terms of how Russia approaches this. Some of it is totally upfront donations to campaigns like Le Pen, and other aspects are more nefarious, Facebook pages, fake news, illegal contributions. So they're playing on all different levels.
I think you mentioned earlier, Lori, the truly remarkable White House press conference with the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of FBI, and General Paul Nakasone, who's the Director of the National Security Agency, in which they made it very clear that there was wide and deep meddling by Russia, not just in our own recent elections, but also ongoing things that could affect the midterm elections to some degree, and in just about all other countries. So I think the position of the security community in the United States in that is pretty clear, and it applies to a lot of nations beyond our own.
Tom, do you want to add anything? Or?
I think the Russians meddle. I mean, I think that's, there used to be a Communist Party of the United States. There were Communist parties throughout Europe. The Soviets tried to pretend that they were separate from the Soviet government. Again, I can understand the motives on the Russian side. They are concerned about European unification and the threat that would pose to them long term. They are concerned about where the United States is. They want to tarnish our reputation as a democratic society as a way of saying to their own people, but to broader elements throughout the global society, that we're really not that bad. We run our country pretty much the way the United States and those so-called Western democracies run their countries. We need to be aware of that. We need to find effective ways of dealing with that. But I come back to my main point again. These are largely problems of our own making that we can solve through our own efforts, and will make the element of Russian meddling a narrower and narrower piece or slice of what is concerned us. If we can be successful societies, that's the best defense that we have against Russia, and it's also the best way we can have positive influence on what's happening inside Russia, because Russians have historically looked up to the United States, looked up to Western Europe, because they consider us to be successful societies, worthy of emulating. And the present discourse in Washington certainly doesn't send that message to Russians at this point. And I think that's true of elsewhere in Europe. So again, getting our own act together is the best defense, and it's the best way to have a positive impact on the internal developments in Russia itself.
So we have time for one more question. Is that, let's go right here.
One thing that was somewhat touched on briefly, but is general powers in Eastern Europe. But me personally, as I have Serbian descent, is how is NATO working with the I want to say the larger former Yugoslavia. One thing we have to realize is that during the Cold War, Yugoslavia was not technically a Soviet satellite state. It was communist, but Tito was an unabashed Yugoslav, and he's going to challenge Stalin at any turn. So he's never a part of the Warsaw Pact. In fact, well, it was, but it was kicked out because Yugoslavia is willing to stand up to him.
And the actual question is,
Yes. Thank you.
How is NATO working with the former Yugoslavia?
I think Montenegro is probably the keyest point in terms of what's happened most recently. I think having a differentiated view to who is in the alliance and who isn't. But I think one of the proudest moments of the alliance was during the 1990s when they were able to conduct operations in former Yugoslavia, such as Allied Force, and actually 3 other operations, and I-4 and S-4 that we're all familiar with for those of us that did operations in former Yugoslavia. I think that was a major inflection point for the NATO alliance, because it was the first significant post-Cold War operation that the alliance had to mount, and also a challenge that was fairly significant on a diplomatic front as well as a military front. And again, as I kind of finish as we started with, I think the diplomatic work that the alliance does as a political alliance is every bit as important as what they do on the military side. I think we saw that clearly demonstrated in former Yugoslavia in the 1990s and right through the present day with the accession of Montenegro into the NATO alliance.
If I could just make a final point on that. I mean, I think you'll find that NATO is actually quite active in the Balkans, not only the operations that we've already talked about in the 1990s, but in trying to prepare the countries of the Western Balkans, former Yugoslavia, for membership. Montenegro is the most recent example. If Macedonia can get through the name change debate, Macedonia will be on the path towards membership in NATO and in the EU. We've done, my understanding is, some changes in the way we're approaching Bosnia-Herzegovina that will allow us to move forward on a map with Bosnia. Kosovo and Serbia are special cases because we've got to solve the issue of Kosovo and Serbia at this point. What I think you'll find, and again, something that is not mentioned enough in public, that NATO is actually working very closely with Serbia. Military to military. There are exchanges, there are some joint exercises and so forth. So NATO is there. NATO has a vision for what they want the future of the Western Balkans to look like, and it is inside the NATO alliance. And again, I think there's a tendency, once again, to exaggerate the role that the Russians are playing. If we know what we want to do, we have the resources, we have the wits to be able to pursue an effective policy in the Western Balkans, no matter what the Russians are up to.
So we have 1 minute left, which leaves you each with a 30-second soundbite to wrap up the session.
Jeez. I thought we were done. Darn.
Give me 30 seconds. to
Just
think.
don't underestimate the importance of the NATO alliance, and imagine for a moment a world without the alliance, and it's not very good. So,
And mine is never underestimate the potential of the United States if we can get our act together. We have the ability to deal with the challenges we face. We need to regain our confidence. We need to put challenges in perspective, and we shouldn't scare ourselves about what's happening in the broader world.
Well, thank you very much for this, and thank you, all of you, for your questions.
All right, well,
enjoyed it, yeah.
first of all, let me mention a couple things. Panel, thank you very much. And the nature of these conferences is sort of like an Army after-action review. It's really focused on what are all the problems. We don't really talk about all the good things that are going on, but what are all the challenges? And it's not really our intention to depress you. If you do need maybe some psychological counseling, if you go out front and meet our folks at the desk, maybe we can work something out.